Hi, it's John here. I've mentioned before that I like to try and ensure there are at least 25 to 30 minutes of content for each of my episodes, but I've realised sticking to this rule often denies the airing of cases that most need exposure. There are several cases that I've placed on the back burner in the hope I will find some more information on them eventually. These include cases such as the 1991 unsolved murder of Heinz Bonn, who is thought to be the first gay German professional footballer. He was stabbed to death aged 50 in his Hanover apartment. Another, also from 1991, is the unsolved murder of 15-year-old Kalisha Tingle from Frankford, Delaware. Then there is the 1972 murder of Nora Wilfred in my home city of Cardiff, Wales. These are just 3 examples of cases that I would love to do episodes about, but I could not find enough publicly available information to even do a 10-minute episode. If you or someone you know could point me towards further sources for these cases, please do get in touch. As you will hear, the case I'm covering today has been with me for decades, and as far as I can see, there has been nothing written about it in over 3 decades. I figured I'm never going to have more sources than I have now, so I decided to go ahead and write and record the episode. So here it is. Back when I was 15, I remember some classmates coming into school and telling me that the previous evening I had featured on the BBC television programme Crime Watch. Of course, what they meant was that someone with the same name as me was mentioned during the show. My classmates didn't really go into details, other than to say the police were looking for this man, called John Dobson. At this point, I had never seen Crime Watch, as the TV normally went off at 10 p.m. in our house, and I didn't have one in my bedroom. I assumed this person must be a wanted criminal. I didn't think much about it, but the story has always stayed with me. After starting the podcast, I decided to look into the case, and discovered that this person who shared my name was not a criminal, but a missing person, and possibly the victim of a crime. Hi, it's John here. I live in Wales, UK, and I research, write and produce Persons Unknown podcast. It's a true crime podcast dedicated to unsolved murders and missing persons cases from all over the world. If you'd like to become a supporter of the podcast, please see the link in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving a review on your app. They make a real difference and I love reading them. Thank you so much for listening. Now back to this week's episode. John Dobson was born on July 10, 1960. He was the only child of parents Richard and Jean Dobson. The couple had been married for many years and thought that they were unable to have children. John was a much-wanted gift and was dearly loved by his mum and dad. The family lived in Preston, Lancashire, in the northwest of England. When John was 18, he went to Sussex University to take a degree in the European Studies department. As part of his course, he spent a year in Paris at the historic and world-renowned Sorbonne University. John was fluent in French and spoke with an excellent accent. After finishing his undergraduate studies, John went to the University of York and then Lancaster University to do a master's degree in social modern history. Lancaster University has several campuses, including one in the Dobson family hometown of Preston. John lived with his parents and had a study room looking out over the garden. The well-read student had shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with books and academic papers. John was a very bright man and seemed to enjoy the world of academia. His mother said in many ways he was a perpetual student, always looking to learn and stretch himself intellectually. Upon arriving at Lancaster University, John, now aged 26, put a note on a notice board inquiring about lift shares or carpooling opportunities. I do not know if John had a driver's license, but at this time it seems he did not have use of a car. A second-year student named Rod responded to the advert. It turned out Rod lived close to John, and the pair made a flexible arrangement, whereby Rod would give John a lift to university, and in return, John contributed toward the cost of petrol. On the morning of Monday, December 1st, 1986, John left the house, telling his mother that he would see her tonight. As was usual, Rod drove John to the university campus in the heart of Preston. Rod later said that everything seemed pretty normal with John, although he was quieter than usual. They arrived on campus at 10 a.m. At midday, John met with Professor Eric Evans, who was the Social Modern History course director. The two talked in Professor Evans's office about some work that John was preparing. An article from The Guardian, March 19, 1994, says that this was a seminar that John was due to present the following day. Professor Evans suggested that John return later that afternoon so they could talk more in depth about the matter. John was non-committal and said he hoped he might be able to return. John left the office and then, well, we don't know what happened after that. John disappeared and no trace of him could be found. His parents reported him missing 2 weeks later. Listeners may think this was quite a long time to wait before taking this action. I'm not sure it was for the time. In 1986, there was no missing persons helpline or social media, and publicity about missing persons cases was not as prevalent as today. Help and advice for families in this situation was not as readily available. There are countless stories of people trying to report loved ones missing in the 1980s, only to find the response from police not terribly helpful, or the process confusing and inefficient. John's parents, Richard and Jean, looked for their son, but turned up nothing. They checked previous known addresses and contacted the academic institutions where he had studied in the past, but got no answers. John had no history of drugs, and there was never any hint he was involved with any sexual or financial scandal. In terms of his mental state, nothing has been shared publicly about John's mental health. Richard and Jean would look for John wherever they went. On one occasion, Jean saw a young man who looked just like her son, but it turned out not to be him. In January 1994, John's case featured in BBC TV's Crime Watch programme. It was part of a new drive to highlight more missing persons stories. Traditionally, Crime Watch had only covered missing persons cases when the police were convinced that a murder had taken place. Due to pressure from police and family members of missing people, the BBC decided to broaden their remit. They included cases where there was no hard evidence, but police suspected that a crime had been committed. I think John Dobson's case was the first to be featured due to these new guidelines. As an aside, the same episode of Crime Watch also did a segment on the case of Stephanie Whittaker, who went missing in March 1990. I covered this case on July 8, 2024. The move by the BBC followed a renewed emphasis by the police on missing persons cases in the wake of the murders committed by husband and wife serial killers Fred and Rose West. The Home Office launched a £270,000 system to help reunite families with their missing loved ones. The National Police Missing Persons Bureau was set up to help coordinate efforts across different organisations and regions. Particular focus was given to more efficient logging of missing vulnerable people, children, the elderly, sick or suicidal people. A 24-hour missing persons helpline was established to provide support for families of missing people, which was soon receiving over 250 calls a week. Just as an aside, the boss of the charity involved in setting up the hotline was on the Crime Watch programme to help deal with the calls they hoped would come in response to the plea about the missing John Dobson. In 2005, this charity boss was sent to prison for 6.5 years for grooming boys for sex. For John's parents, the segment on Crime Watch did not lead to the whereabouts of their son, or to any closure at all. From the aforementioned Guardian article, it's clear that Jean and Richard could not understand why John left and went away. It made no sense to them when it happened, nor over 7 years later in March 1994. Jean said at that time, "We have nothing to grieve, and it hasn't got any easier." In March 1994, Richard and Jean were looking into the possibility that John might be living in France. Remember, he studied there for a time and spoke fluent French. They said they would not rest until they found their son. They had kept his study exactly as he left it, still full of the books he loved and his grey typewriter. It was all ready for him to walk back in through the front door. Unfortunately, that is the last piece of information about John's case that I can find. In 2023, a member of the public made a Freedom of Information request concerning the status of John's missing person case to Lancashire Constabulary. The questions asked were: is the case of John Dobson resolved? If so, how so? Example, located alive, located deceased. If not, is the case of John Dobson currently under active investigation? Have any people been charged and or convicted of any crimes relating to the disappearance of John Dobson? The request was refused by Lancashire Constabulary. You can read the full details of this in my list of sources. I cannot find John Dobson on missingpeople.org website, but that is not overly significant considering there are other missing persons cases I have covered on the podcast that are also not listed there. I have found an old 2023 link to a police website which appears to have a listing for John Dobson as a missing person, but it is no longer active. John Dobson is listed as an unsolved murder on the website unsolvedmurders.co.uk. However, this is not an official police website. Everyone has the right to go off on their own and move away from their family if they choose. In instances like this, the issue is that the family, and indeed the police, simply don't know if this is what has happened, or if the person has come to harm. John Dobson would now be 66 years old. If you have any information about the disappearance of John Dobson in December 1986, you can call Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111. If you have been affected by someone you know going missing, or if you yourself are thinking of going missing, you can call or text the UK charity Missing People for support on 116 000.